King's Cross stands on top of a hill a mile or so east of the city of Sydney. Its population safely barricaded against the world of law, order, conformity and common sense in a monstrous jumble of buildings of every style and shape. Only one thing these buildings have in common. They're packed with people, even though most of them don't seem to venture out by daylight. In this 1 square mile live 100,000 people. That makes the Cross the most densely populated white area in the world. On the battlements of the Cross, the white flags of the downstairs armies flutter. There are few sentries on guard because the denizens of the Cross have survived many assaults on their citadel, and the enemy has always been repulsed. To the east, the Cross looks out on the gleaming waters of Elizabeth Bay and the harbour stretching towards the heads. Today, the gently sloping foreshores are crammed with flats and home units all the way up to the top of Macleay Street and the heart of the Cross. To the northwest, the Cross overlooks Woolloomooloo, with the jagged skyline of the city to the west. Everywhere you look, there is a sea of brick and stone washing around the base of the hill on which the Cross is built. It was not always so, of course. 130 years ago, there were windmills at the Cross at the top of William Street. Governor Macquarie named the area Henrietta Town after his wife, and ships from England tied up off the point as they waited to move into Sydney Cove. From the Cove, an Aboriginal track ran south to where St. Mary's Cathedral now stands. Then turned east and followed the line of what is now William Street right up to the top of the hill. In 1830, the tree-lined bush track became William Street, named after William of England. Sir Thomas Mitchell, the Surveyor General, intended to curve the road to avoid the steep slope at the top. But while he was away from Sydney, it was built straight up the hill and gave the early horse-drawn traffic a difficult climb. From 1830 onwards, the area entered its age of elegance, as the foreshores and Potts Point became the showplace of Sydney's fashionable way of life. The green slopes were divided into land grants for those who found favour with the governors of the day, and up went the mansions. Craig End, the home of Sir Thomas Mitchell, who fought King's Cross's first duel with pistols against Sir Stuart Donaldson, the first Premier of New South Wales. Sir Thomas Mitchell got a bullet through his whiskers, and his bullet went through Donaldson's hat. All that's left of Craig End now is the street named after the house. Greenough, which stood from 1831 until the 1920s when it gave way to a block of flats. Orwell, built for the colony's first judge, Mr. Justice Stephen. In 1915, it vanished beneath the brick undergrowth of Orwell Street. Then there was Tusculum, which still stands after more than 130 years. Today it is penned in by blocks of flats, but despite conversions into a hospital, an officers' club for the American forces during the last war, and now a hotel, it lingers on and even maintains some of its old elegance. In 1825, there arrived in Sydney a man who was to leave his mark on King's Cross. He was the new colonial secretary, Alexander Macleay. In 1828, he was given a grant of 54 acres overlooking Elizabeth Bay. And there, Alexander Macleay built for his wife Eliza and their 9 children a house that has become a classic of early colonial architecture. In particular, the graceful elliptical cantilevered staircase in the entrance hall. Today, Elizabeth Bay House is converted into 16 flats, and the 54 acres garden has shrunk to less than a quarter of an acre. But even the encroaching flats and home units cannot shut out the view of the harbour that Alexander Macleay presented to his wife Eliza. Macleay Street is named after Alexander Macleay, and the gates of Elizabeth Bay House used to be at the present junction of Macleay Street and Elizabeth Bay Road. To drive down this road to the house today, as the carriages used to clip-clop down the private driveway, is to realize the extent of Macleay's original property, granted in a more spacious age than ours. By 1875, houses had spilled down towards Rushcutters Bay, although big trees still fringed New Southhead Road. From Rushcutters Bay, looking back towards the cross, there were plenty of trees to be seen, and the spire of St. John's Church on the skyline. This church was built in 1858, a faithful exercise in medieval Gothic. The old fire station followed in 1882 in Victorian immutable. Both church and fire station are still in business, although business is pretty slow at both places. The fire station stands at the only place which is actually entitled to call itself King's Cross, the junction of 6 roads at the top of William Street. And there's probably not one of the 100,000 inhabitants who know that it was originally called Queen's Cross. This name was bestowed on the junction by the Municipal Council in 1897 to mark Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. But by 1905, confusion began to arise between Queen's Cross and Queen's Square in the city, so the name was changed to King's Cross. But there never has been a plaque or a street sign to mark the christening of Sydney's lustiest, fastest-growing area. For by the end of the century, the great estates were being cut up, and row upon row of terraced houses in the English Victorian style were being built in the parklands that once surrounded the mansions. As fast as the famous and the wealthy sold their properties, they were turned into rooms and apartments, hotels and boarding houses. After the First World War, when trams and cars joined the horse-drawn carriages on the long climb up William Street to the cross, William Street itself had to be widened. The process took 10 years, and when this picture was taken, the old post office still stuck halfway across the street up near the cross. By 1922, the cross had settled into its present familiar layout, although the neon signs and strip joints had yet to appear. But now the cross was entering the period that was to stamp its character forever. For this was when the cross went bohemian. In the narrow streets behind these buildings, writers and artists and their girlfriends crammed into tiny rooms to share the rent they didn't intend to pay anyway. The parties lasted for days, and so must the hangovers after a drink like the King's Cross Express, which one inspired host dreamed up for his guests. It was mixed in a new garbage tin and consisted of whiskey, champagne, red wine, beer, gin, stout and lemonade, with raisins and sliced apples, brewed for several days and stirred with a broom handle.